All right, today we're going into speed versus strength, and I've had a little bit of a debate back and forward with someone on Instagram about a recent post. I'm going to talk through my perspective and some of what I understand of his perspective, and the goal is just to have some fun and share some ideas. They are important ideas and things to consider, and I hope you get something out of exploring these thought processes. So we've recently seen this guy who's 104 kilos run a 10:35. So if you look at him compared to these other guys, he is a different species. Now, he doesn't go and win the race, but carrying 20 kilos, 30 kilos more down the track at a similar speed for a lot of different sports, that is an advantage, and that is a better position to be in. So I think it's worth considering the cost of training like a sprinter if you want to look like, DK Metcalf. Extremely fast, and he's not training specifically for that. He's currently been playing in the NFL, and he's been focused on that for a number of years. So, could he run fractionally faster and be in the middle of that field or at the head of that field at the same body weight? Probably, potentially. Interesting question to ask. Anyway, speed versus strength. So these posts, our good friend Graham Tuttle is experimenting with some of these jumps. We've been talking about the DB hammer system. And so you can see landing, stretching, jumping back on the box. And the contention that some people would suggest that it's only the connective tissues doing this. My suggestion is that with so much deformation, so much change in the heel position after the toes touch the ground, the muscles are contributing to this, and the muscles will start to burn after some period of time. The muscles are burning because they're working. So even on the double leg jump, you can see there's a significant component of muscle work going on in my opinion, my perspective. Now, what started the conversation was I'm saying that the muscle has to do the work on landing, that it's reversing the eccentric because the muscle is contracting and it's being forced into length. At some weight, that is true. If he's adding more and more weight, then we definitely know there's an eccentric, right? If he's got 100 kilos on his back when he's doing this, no one's going to argue that there isn't going to be an eccentric. I would suggest that when we go into single leg versus the double leg, that there is enough weight there that there's a significant eccentric contraction where this is just too heavy for his calf muscle to put the tendon to work. So the muscle must put the tendon to work. And whether they're super stiff reps and you can't see any change in the ankle angle after landing, some would say that it's the stretch in the tendon that's providing that change. We did the maths on that, looking at 4 to 6% change in Achilles tendon of 15 centimeters. Then maybe it's the fascia. It can get really complicated if you're trying to answer this mathematically. But he's saying categorically the muscle acts isometrically. The tendon does all the work. Even in itself, that comment to me is contradictory, because if the muscle is acting isometrically, then it is doing work. It is resisting a lot of force going down, and the muscle is stopping that force. It puts the tendon to work. What I'm saying is the tendon is dumb. The muscle must put the tendon to work. Dunkers and high jumpers tend to have big calves relative to the rest of their muscles. I don't think, to me, it's not something controversial. I wouldn't consider, that I didn't think that there would be any kind of argument against that. I do understand that people say there is no eccentric. At this weight, for him, I'm pretty sure, confident that there's a significant eccentric going on in the muscle, and that makes it more muscular. And this is an important conversation because it influences how we need to train, and whether calf size is important, whether there needs to be hypertrophy for the calves. And then that extrapolates to every other muscle in the body, depending on the sport that we're playing. So this conversation, I think, goes back to, I trace the line of thinking that I'm speaking with here to Franz Bosch's work and the idea that the hamstring acts isometrically. And this is not a proven concept. This is a theory and an idea. Some people say it's true. Some say it's not. There is an argument for, an argument against. I'm going to explore more of that. So I would suggest here that the muscle is putting the tendon to work. If the muscle doesn't contract, the tendon does nothing. The tendon doesn't have any tension. The tendon cannot do anything. So I'm saying the tendon is dumb and the muscle is what puts the tendon to work. It puts the spring to work. So I've made whole lectures around this tendon versus muscle concept, and the tendon is very, very, very important. I would say the tendon is the tripler. The tendon is the amplifier, but it's the amplifier of either muscle or momentum. Okay, so we either need muscle as the motor to power up the tendons, or we need to bring momentum in. So in highly momentum-driven activities, then we can just focus more on the tendon because we don't have to accelerate. We don't need that muscular component as much. Now, because those sports exist, things like high jump to an extent, things like fast bowling, things like top speed running, there's a significant momentum component. When you run in for a high jump, there's momentum there. And so you can focus more on the tendon, and there's not quite as much need for muscle strength. There is still that need for muscle strength for the stiffness, but not the same amount to get the acceleration, to get it moving, as there are in almost all other activities where momentum isn't such a big contributor. In fast bowling, you have a very light implement and you get to run up for a long distance. So it's an extremely high speed movement against a very, very low resistance. So of course, that becomes less muscular and more tendon, connective tissue, fascial. The same thing with top speed running, where you've got a fraction of a second, 0.1 of a second-ish of ground contact in which to produce force. So the muscle will always do its best to contribute, and the muscle will contribute as much as it can. The longer the ground contact time is, the more it's going to contribute, and the better adapted it is, to be able to contribute force in the short amount of time that it has available. It can be trained to put more force in a shorter period of time. So if the tendon is the tripler, then what's triple nothing? So as I'm saying, for high speed bowling, Stephen Jones is doing really, really interesting work and super creative. He was a student of Phil Richards. Phil was a student of Louis Simmons and Charles Poliquin, and they're both really innovative guys. And I think that he's making a really important contribution to the world of strength. But it's also important to consider that there is a huge momentum component, and it's a very high speed activity, fast bowling, and to confuse that with the demands of rugby and the demands of even soccer, where there's a lot of start, stop, change of direction, there is a much higher strength component in soccer and long ground contact time. That's all you need to know. If there are long ground contact times, then it's strength. The longer the ground contact times are, the more strength is involved. But even in these activities, so you have to be fairly light for these activities, and you do see these skinny fast bowlers who are extremely powerful, and putting on size is not necessarily going to be useful for these guys because it is so momentum and connective tissue driven. Even when we look at Stefan Holm here, he has big calves. He has relatively big legs compared to his, relatively big thighs compared to his upper body. And it's momentum here. You see, he does accelerate quite hard in between the reps, and he's able to transfer the momentum. So he does have amazing tendon ability. He also has really thick calves that are able to power up his tendons or transfer the force into his tendons. If the calves don't contract, then the tendons will do nothing. Okay, so it makes sense for these super high speed athletes to use isometrics and gain minimal size. Isometrics are great for adding strength without adding size. And that's going to support, if you use isometrics and high speed movements, then you're going to, that's probably the best approach for bowling faster. But it's a danger to extrapolate that out to be what everybody needs. Everybody probably needs some of it, and that's why it's an important contribution. But you need to look at the specific demands. So as we get more specific about top speed running and fast bowling, then we're going to see less and less correlation to strength. But a lot of activities have longer ground contact times, and therefore strength is a bigger driver. Okay, so what happens if the muscle fails? Well, there's three kind of options. You can get sort of inhibition, where you just collapse. So if you jump down off a 3-meter platform, you're either going to collapse, or you're going to receive the force eccentrically. So you are going to, you're not going to completely buckle, but the muscle, the thing's going to lengthen, or it's going to tear. So if it's too much force, these are the things that are going to happen to the muscle. The tendon, it only has the option to rupture. So the muscle is the smart component, and the muscle is what protects the tendon. So the muscle is the limiting factor. The muscle has the hand. The tendon is just the band, as far as we understand it. Now, there may be more to come in terms of fascial tension and contractility of fascia, and it is an interesting area, but I don't think we're ever going to see that the fascia is creating significant change in length. Like the driver of the change in length is going to be always the muscle. And yeah, basically the muscle is what's has the most potential for impact from the brain. So it's connected. The hand here is the brain, and the brain is deciding, okay, this is too much force. We just need to collapse, because otherwise something is going to break. Either the tendon or the muscle is going to break. So that inhibition cycle is coming from the muscle area. So what happens if the muscle wasn't driving the process? Then the tendon would always be at risk, because it's just a band. It's just sitting there doing its thing. And so the muscle then is the governor or the limiter, which makes the muscle so important. And I think that if we don't consider the muscle to be important, then we're going to cause more injury, and we're going to decrease performance or leak performance. That relative strength component, very, very difficult to argue against. And the problem is with using strength rather than tension. Okay, so how much tension can you handle relative to your body weight is probably a better consideration than how much slow strength can be produced. But if we can handle a lot of tension, then that's where high performance happens. And you can't have high performance without massive forces, without massive tension, and therefore the muscle will always be strong. So in a high force environment, it doesn't mean it's big, but it means it's always strong. So it contributes what it can in force given the time available. So the muscle will always try to support the movement as well. So it's going to have a microsecond of eccentric, according to most of the research, and then it's going to have an isometric. Some say there is no microsecond of eccentric, but it looks unlikely. The longer the ground contact, or the heavier the activity, the more definite it is that there is an eccentric there, or the lower relative strength means that there's going to be more eccentric as well, which is what I'm saying with Graham. I think he'll need more strength to shorten that eccentric and to make it a more of an isometric, or look like at least an isometric. They're saying quasi-isometric because it kind of looks like an isometric, but it's just because they're so strong that the eccentric lasts for a very short period of time, and then the force is reversed, and then as much concentric force will be added to the movement as possible before we leave the ground. Like it's logical, and it's obviously what's happening. When we make it longer, then it's clear that the muscle component's really big. As we make it shorter, for sure the contribution's less, but to say there's no contribution is probably highly unlikely, because otherwise the muscle wouldn't burn and we just wouldn't be able to accelerate. Like we are putting as much force as we can into the ground, and then the muscles start to fatigue, and we put less force into the ground. It's not the tendons that fatigue. The tendons aren't going to fatigue, as far as I understand. They're the bands. I don't understand the fatigue mechanism in tendons. If someone has the fatigue mechanism for tendons understood and they'd like to share it, I'd love to be enlightened about how tendons are fatiguing. The research is clear from my understanding that the tendon doesn't fatigue. The tendon doesn't mind doing lots and lots and lots and lots of work. It's just how high the tension is on that, and the muscle is what protects the tendon by inhibiting itself if the tension is going to be too high, that something's going to break. So do muscles or tendons drive performance? Muscles or momentum load the tendons, right? So it's the muscle or momentum that loads the tendons. Tendons are impotent without the muscles. That's what I'm saying in the post. Is sprinting draining because it uses a lot of neural energy? This is a question for you. Sprinting is neurologically very demanding. So where is that demand being placed? And you could say, well, it's the rest of the body that's not touching the ground. It's it's waving your arms, moving your arms, bracing the core. That's where the neural energy is all going to. Okay, but where's the highest force? The biggest forces are where the friction happens with the ground. And so it makes sense that is what's most neurally draining. If anyone's, if you skip, if you're double foot jumping, it requires much less muscle than single foot. So if you jump on 2 feet and you're trained, then you'll be able to jump for a lot longer than you can on 1 foot. That's because the muscle fatigues. The muscle fatigues because it's doing a lot of work. The burn is the muscle fatigue. If someone's untrained, then 2 foot jumping is going to fatigue them quickly, and their muscles are going to burn and they're going to breathe hard. The metabolic cost in the tendon is negligible. It doesn't have the ability to use a lot of ATP, using up energy. So it has to be the muscle that is doing a significant amount of the work. Whether that work is as an isometric, an eccentric, into an isometric, into a concentric, we can debate about that, but we can't debate that the muscle is doing a lot of work. Okay, so we're mixing up these things of saying, yeah, tendons are really important, and then we're throwing the muscle out, and that's not something that we can do, and still. So you can do it philosophically, because whenever you're trying to train the tendon, you're training the muscle anyway. So you're not doing what you think you're doing, and therefore you can have that philosophy and get away with it. But you're missing the point, and you're creating, you're missing out on gains, because at times more muscle is definitely going to be the answer. If you're going from being a 15-year-old rugby player to being a 20-year-old rugby player, you're going to add a lot of muscle during that time, and you're going to need to add a lot of muscle. Otherwise, you just don't get to play. Like, there is a buy-in in terms of muscle number and muscle mass, and it doesn't have to mean a decrease in athleticism. We want to do both. We want to keep the tendon strong and develop that system, as well as the muscular system. So because bodybuilding and less than optimal strength training negatively impacts tendons and speed, people are going too far and throwing the baby out with the bathwater and saying, like, let's stop strength training, or it's elite performance is all about the tendon and isometrics. And that's just a long, long way from the truth. It's a dangerous place to go to, in my opinion, my experience. So yeah, calves are burning, not the hips. Okay. So the calves are doing the work. So, you could make the contention of, well, it's an isometric at the foot, but then, the hip is maybe contributing to the force to be able to jump up higher. But no, it's the calf that burns. It's the calf where the metabolic action is happening. Therefore, it is the calf muscle. So let's have a look at it again. You can see when it's double foot, the relative strength is higher. The ground contact time is going to be shorter, even though he's jumping off a higher box. And you can see how much more comfortable it is. It's a continuous movement, so it's more coordinated. He's able to, to dominate this movement. Yeah, ground contacts are quite short. I would still say within this, there is a significant eccentric of the muscle, and I would say there is some concentric. He could probably emphasize that a little bit more in terms of push off But yeah, I think there is a clear eccentric, isometric, concentric. Now, going into these single legs, which is where the conversation started, the muscle contribution is significantly more. You can see he's battling to handle that force on the landing. To me, it looks clear. It's, we might have different opinions on that, but the ground contact time, you can see that much bigger change in angle at the ankle, and he's stopping each repetition because it's not so comfortable. So if he was to do a lot of these, he would get sore calf muscles. This is also the mechanism for snapping the Achilles tendon. So it's definitely loading the tendon hard. And the reason why he's getting that big eccentric is because the body doesn't want the Achilles to snap. Even if the strength is there in the calf, the body is always going to protect itself. So it protects itself by not putting force into the ground, too much force into the ground. So as the calf gets stronger, he'll be able to create more of an isometric there, and that contact time will decrease, and there'll be, or less inhibition. There's different mechanisms of why, how that's going to improve. Fractionally improving that can make a significant improvement in performance. Okay, so getting to the end here, some of the conversations that we had, I might break this off into a separate one to go through some of the individual points, since we've already gone for 20 minutes there. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. It is like a big topic for students of strength and conditioning, of sports science, working with athletes. We're getting this stuff from high-speed running and high-speed bowling brought over into the world of more complex athletic sports with longer ground contact times. And I think it's an important conversation for us to have. So hopefully I've kept this tone positive, and I do appreciate, having that conversation and exploring these ideas. I think that's a healthy thing for us to do. And there's probably some things here that I've said that don't make sense or that might not be correct. What I'm sharing is my understanding of things, and this approach has resulted in the results that I've had so far. We'll talk a little bit about results versus research as well in the next part. So I hope you enjoyed this.